eating and talking. We're going to move on with a little bit of more program because we're trying to get, frankly, a tremendous amount accomplished today in a very short period of time. And walking around the different rooms, the energy level made me realize we really could probably keep you all having this conversation in an engaged way for a couple, 3 days, and we don't have that. I'd like to particularly commend the two groups that were up in Bagley. I'm not sure whether it was so much that they were just divided by a scrim and the noise level that made it challenging, although I didn't know it made it necessarily challenging. The amplitude in both rooms was pretty good. But when I walked in, somewhere in this town somebody is making a lot of bacon. And the smell was permeating those two rooms, and I couldn't last very long before I thought, ooh, lunch. So let me take a couple of minutes to thank a few folks. I did thank some sponsors this morning, but want to call out a few individuals as well. Joe Bradley at Vita, East Creek Catering again, all of our panelists, and Chris Delia for moderating. You know, we spent, as you may notice, there's been a lot of substance work that's gone into this in the background, and the time, commitment, and preparation for the folks that are facilitating and speaking was not small, and I really appreciate it. Abby Strauss and John Finley from Maverick and Boutique, Mark Waterhouse from Garnet, who will be speaking over lunch. Our sponsors, Green Mountain Power, in particular Mary Powell, Steve Terry, and Steve Costello, who have been highly engaged. When we started talking about where to do this, and I thought about the building that they're renovating, and they said, that's an interesting idea, you're nuts. I like this venue also, and the notion that we can come together in this beautiful space for these sessions and then go to the very workmanlike rooms that we're doing the background work. It's kind of symbolic of the way we all do our economic development work. There's a lot that goes on in the backgrounds and then a little bit that happens in front of folks, and it's a good reminder of the fact that this is nuts and bolts work that we have to do. Yes, there's some big policy stuff, but a lot of it is blocking and tackling. Members of the legislature come to me and say, well, what pieces of legislation are you going to propose? What do we need to do? You know, a lot of it is execution, and it's not huge fancy stuff. It's just getting the fundamentals right, getting the networking right, getting people connected to the right person with the least amount of effort, taking away the friction in the system. And there's folks in this room who are particularly good at that, and a lot of work for the RDCs. And so I'd like to thank in particular Jamie Stewart, Joan Goldstein, and Pat Moulton-Powden, who worked on the planning committee of this event. This is not an agency event. This is a much broader participation event. Also, a bunch of folks at the agency who did a lot of work on this, in particular Ken Jones, an intern, William Goodenough, Tricia Standen, everybody from PTAC, Robin Miller, Joanne Spalding, and Angela Owen are here today, Jana Guilford and Fred Kenny, and a whole bunch of other people who touched this, Kirsten Bourgeois, Lucy Larish, Megan Smith, Noelle McKay. It's been a lot of thought going into this. And I'd also particularly like to thank Bruce Bouchard and Tom O'Brien in the Paramount Theater for hosting us. This really is a great spot, and it's neat to see it put to a very different use than it's probably seen before. And lastly, I would be really out of place if I didn't thank the EDA. We've got a couple of folks, there are a number of people in the room who've pursued different kinds of EDA grants over the last few years, and I think all of us have been variously incredibly frustrated with that process and enormously grateful. So Matthew Sokotowski is the regional guy who's been in Vermont for the last couple of years since Irene, has really been helping a lot of organizations get connected to resources. And Willie Taylor, who runs the section down in Philadelphia, has been very responsive. And I think there's a lot of things that have been done in the last couple of years out of Irene that are transforming the way we do business, state government level, and I hope we're able to take advantage of this kind of networking and some of the boundaries that have been broken going forward to keep a little less friction out of the system. So I'm pleased to interrupt. I'm pleased to interrupt myself. Yeah. It was a little warmer this weekend than this good sleeping weather for me. It's nice to have it, but it takes me a little time to adjust. So the core of this kickoff is twofold, as I said this morning. We're starting this long-term cycle that we hope to have recurring in economic development strategic planning in the state, maintain common language, common objectives, common understandings, and to surface things that don't necessarily turn up in Montpelier on a daily basis, but turn up out in the rest of the state on a daily or hourly basis that we ignore, and try not to ignore those. So the thing that we're doing here is relative to the EDA funding is a CEDS, Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, of which we've got a couple in region of the states, but this will essentially gerrymander and fill out the state. It's not meant to replace that work. It's not meant to inhibit any region from doing regional planning going forward, but to jumpstart something and to do it with a real data-based methodology. Garnet Consulting was the successful bidder, and they've just come off doing the Chittenden County CEDS, and so we've done a lot of work in the state. They understand many of the issues that we have. They understand the regulatory and economic framework. That being that Chittenden County is so close to Vermont, they've had a good view. So Mark Waterhouse is going to speak to us. He's the president of Garnet. He's a graduate of Dartmouth, which is practically a Vermont institution. Went out to Oklahoma, to the Economic Development Institute there, and certainly our thoughts are with our colleagues in Oklahoma who are facing a string of really horrific events. We talk about having to recover from some impacts. I know how intimidating it was to get the call and say, wait, we've got about 7,000 folks 7,000 families who are displaced. Could you help sort out the short-term issues? And that was intimidating. Imagine waking up as the mayor of Moore. I mean, good God. So he's the past chair of the International Economic Development Council, past dean of the Economic Development Institute at the University of Oklahoma. He's got a range of experience in local community economic development. Goes through a lot of projects, and I won't recite all the years of programs or projects because he just doesn't look that old, and I don't buy it. And ending with the CEDS process, and we've worked together on a couple of things, and I think we've got a tremendously high confidence in their work, and appreciate you coming to Vermont. Thank you.
Thank you. Is the microphone on? It's on my button. Okay. One of the things that he didn't mention is that I am a former Marine officer, and I'm used to being very loud, so I generally don't need microphones. So if I get too loud, wave at me, and I will tone it down some. As Lawrence mentioned, two things are going on here simultaneously. One is that you're having your first annual or second after 20 years or Economic Development Planning Summit, which is important in and of itself. But the second piece is, as Lawrence mentioned, starting the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy process for the state of Vermont. There are many states that do not have such a critter. They leave it to the individual regions or counties or economic development districts to create strategies, but at a state level, this can be an unusual thing. I think that will give you a leg up. It will position the state of Vermont very attractively and competitively for future economic development in a world that is changing, and we're not real sure what many of those changes are going to be. Now, how many of you need a little bit of a primer on what a CEDS is all about? Okay, a few. I sort of feel like I'm in the position of the flight attendant who got in I was on the plane about a year ago, and the flight attendant got to the point where he had to talk about putting on a seat belt, and he said, for those of you who have not ridden in the car in the last 30 years, let me tell you how to put on a seat belt. Well, for many of you, you're just as familiar with what the CEDS process is as I am, but for those who are less familiar, let me walk you through it very briefly. These are a couple of extracts out of a 2-page handout that the Federal Economic Development Administration has available on what this thing called a CEDS is all about. And basically it says that it is first and foremost a process. The process is almost as important as the end product, because the process is where you get everybody's fingerprints on the process, and therefore they have the ownership of the product that emerges. It needs to involve both the public and private sectors, and it is supposed to do something that results in a strengthened, their words, regional economy. In this instance, the region is the state, not a sub-portion of the state. And it is supposed to be a continuing process. You don't just do this now and stop planning for another 20 years. It is supposed to start the planning process where every once in a while, and a typical time frame for a CEDS is 5 years. You have to renew it, redo it, update it every 5 years. But in between those 5-year major procedures and processes, you need to be in planning mode constantly, because new opportunities arise, new challenges present themselves, and one of the things that you need to do is institutionalize the planning process so that you'll be doing this continually to solve economic development problems, to capitalize on economic development activities, and know whether or not you're doing that effectively by having agreed upon metrics that will say, yes, we're doing it well, yes, we're making progress. These are not just metrics of activity, big failing of the economic development profession. We're really good at measuring activity. We are very poor at measuring impact and accomplishment. So one of the things that we want to try and help Vermont do is position yourselves so that you know whether or not you've got effective impact and accomplishment. A thought process as to why you should be going through this 10 or 12 month process, lots of meetings, lots of effort, lots of funding, fortunately from EDA. Economic development almost never occurs for free. You can't just sit and aggressively wait for the phone to ring. I mean, that's not how it works. So you need to invest in your economic development activities. Well, if you're going to make investments like any business, those investments ought to be guided by a well thought out plan. That's what the CEDS is all about. And if you're going to make those investments, you ought to expect to get that return on investment. That is what the metrics are all about. Now, having a CEDS will make you eligible, potentially, for some Economic Development Administration funding, EDA funding, particularly infrastructure funding. Now that raises the issue, I mentioned this in the group that was talking about infrastructure this morning. If you haven't seen it yet, because it's brand new, Google 2013 Infrastructure Report Card. Every 4 years, the American Society of Civil Engineers puts out an infrastructure report card. The new one is just out. You can then find the Vermont tab, click on it, and see how Vermont's infrastructure was evaluated. If I remember correctly, you got a D. Okay? It says, like most of the country, there are lots of infrastructure needs that need funding. I mean, we're talking trillions of dollars nationwide. Well, if you've got a plan, like I said, you may be able to get some of your tax dollars that you sent to Washington coming back to you for the infrastructure projects that EDA may consider funding. And whether or not you get EDA dollars, this also gives you a plan that may be of interest to other agencies, federal and state agencies, where they see that you have thought carefully about what needs to be done. You know what you expect to get for a return on investment, and you may be able to use the plan to persuade them to invest money in your project. End product is a broadly shared vision and game plan for Vermont's economic development efforts over the next 5 years. And that's that sharing of information, that sharing of commitment, like you're demonstrating today, that will be the foundation for successful implementation of the plan. Now, why are we doing it here? Number one, we're looking at repositioning Vermont's business sector to be more resilient after Irene, and positioning you so that you're more resilient if there's another natural disaster that hurts you, that hits you. In my estimation, equally and perhaps more important is that broad economic development game plan. You're all members of the state's economic development team. Any team needs a game plan to guide where it is you're going. Here's a mindset for you. If we start with business robustness, strength, and we add business resiliency, ability to bounce back, and we add sustainability so that what we're doing has strong legs over a long term, not just being the pet rock for this year's economy, we have a good chance of having economic vitality, and that's what you and every other state wants in their economic development program. So yes, emergency preparedness, important. That's particularly true because of the source of the funding that you're getting from this project, but also positioning yourself for a rapidly changing economy globally, changes in competition, new rules and regulations coming out of Washington and other places, and what I call the Baxter effect. Any of you familiar with Baxter? I found Baxter last fall. I was going down to the IEDC conference in Houston, and after that conference we were going to have a meeting at the University of Houston, which has a really neat master's program in futures studies. I've met with some of the kids that are in that program or graduates of that program. They're doing things that make your head hurt if you're not one of those kids. They're thinking about things that are foreign to those of us in the baby boomer generation. And I found this article in, I don't remember, Inc. or Entrepreneur magazine about Baxter. This is Baxter. How many of you have as part of your economic development responsibilities assuring that the most people in your area possible have a good job? Yeah? And if possible, manufacturing jobs, right? Baxter is a little industrial robot. Costs $22,000, about half of the cost of a typical industrial robot. You can take it out of the box, set it up, program it, and have it operating in an hour or less. It operates on now this is one of these things that future studies, an open source robot operating system. Have you ever heard of a robot operating system? They got one. And the scary thing is that Baxter is projected to do away with somewhere between 23 and 30 million American jobs in the next 10 years. Now, the difference, that 7 million difference between 23 and 30 million, had to do with whether or not they could figure out how to program Baxter to flip burgers. Don't need to do that anymore, because Baxter's got a girlfriend now. Baxter's girlfriend, this is clever now, Baxter's girlfriend is named Patty, and Patty can cook, assemble, wrap almost 400 burgers an hour. So flipping burgers, the last refuge for the low-skill worker, may also be replaced with a robot. Those are the kinds of challenges domestically and globally that we are faced with as we go forth. I feel like Star Trek. We're going forth to a place where no man has been before. You know, that's part of the reality of economic development. Now here's some numbers of interest. Conway Data, publisher of Site Selection Magazine, tracks announcements of projects, manufacturing, office or headquarters, warehouse distribution, research and development, speculative buildings, or some mix thereof. And every March issue of Site Selection Magazine, they publish their scorecard, and this is what has happened over the last 12 years. We've actually been on an uptick the last 3 years. We're back up over 5,000, over 5,500 jobs, but the number of projects that met one of 3 tests, there's a lot of smaller projects, so these are the larger ones that we all like to get. $1 million or more in capital investment, or 50 or more jobs, or 20,000 square feet or more new building or addition. The number of projects nationwide in the United States in 2012 is down 55% from what it was in the year 2000. Total of almost 84,000 projects, pretty good number. How'd Vermont do? In that same 12-year period, you have had 7/100ths of a percentage point of the projects in the United States. Now, maybe that's a reasonable number based on the fact that you're a relatively small state in terms of population, but maybe you're not satisfied with that number, and that's a challenge for us to take a look at as we go forward into the future. You can see segmented both new or expanded manufacturing, and then the other is all of those other categories that I mentioned. So that's something that we need to think about as we do the CEDS. Here's how this process is going to play out. The overall oversight is your Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and I'm the coordinator of a multi-firm team that amongst us, as near as I could estimate, done about 600 projects across the country, and in fact in several other countries. Garnet Consulting Services, my firm, Leslie Cosgrove and me, will be the coordinating role. Then we have Camoin Associates. Camoin is largely, well, not largely. They've got an office in Albany, they've got an office in Maine, and Rachel Selsky is here from the office in Brattleboro. If you still have lunch on your lap, don't stand up. So Rob Camoin, Jim Demesis is in Maine, Rachel. Then we have Wadley Donovan Growth Tech. You may be familiar with Wadley Donovan. They were part of our team that did the Chittenden County CEDS. They're also a major site location consulting firm. One division works with companies. Growth Tech works with communities. Bill Frederick, Maverick and Boutique. Many of you have met John Findlay and Abby Strauss. Are you out there, John and Abby? They're in the back. Harold and Associates, or Robbie Harold, one of your neighbors from Montpelier. Robbie's been involved in the economic development business in Vermont for a long, long time. And equally important, you, the stakeholders. You're the folks that will make this process work. Now, it didn't say in the notes that I gave Lawrence for introduction that I am a Marine officer, so I expect you to stand straight and march efficiently. And I'm going to be riding you to make sure that we get a good project out of this. Foundations, Lawrence mentioned, places that already have CEDS. We're not ignoring them. We're going to build on them and develop a clear understanding of them. Many other elements, the existing plans, documents, organizations that we already know about, we've already familiarized ourselves with, or will do that in the near future. And then just as continue the primer on what a CEDS is, again, these are things that EDA includes as part of the process. I mentioned the public-private partnership. EDA requires a broadly representative CEDS or strategy committee, and the majority of that committee has to be from the private sector. So we're looking at that private-public partnership. And then the resulting document has to cover lots of different things, an understanding of where you have been, an identification of where it is you want to go, and a game plan that tells you how to get there. And that's the Reader's Digest version of lots of verbiage from EDA on what is expected. And we need to make sure that we take advantage of any other plans and figure out what we're proposing for you, what you're proposing for you relates to other plans. So you see, these are what I would call the sustainability elements. Chittenden County was a project where the CEDS was not funded by EDA. It was funded by a HUD sustainability grant, but you find that many of these elements are articulated by HUD just as they are articulated by EDA in terms of paying attention to transportation and environment, workforce and technology, and so on and so forth, with the recognition that where it will move into effective implementation or fall apart is the last line: funding. Planning is relatively easy and relatively inexpensive. Implementing gets expensive and more difficult. So lots of places have the old forklift reports that are used as a paperweight or a doorstop, because they got lots of good ideas in them, but nobody came up with the resources necessary to move in implementation mode, and we will try and effectively position you to do that. Metrics specifically identified by EDA. We need to talk about the jobs created and jobs retained by whatever it is we're doing. We need to talk about the kinds of investments that we're going to have and how much private sector investment we can leverage with limited government funding. We need to specifically be trying to change the economy of the state of Vermont, and there may be measures that you identify that are equally important. The process that we typically use when we're doing these CEDS, and which is outlined in our proposal on this, has 22 discrete tasks divided up over 5 phases or some ongoing activities. And you can see these are the phases that we have identified. And here are the elements of those phases. I will not bore you with going into all of them. We are at the very beginning of the process. In fact, we're just finishing up the contract on it. So first thing we'll do, hitting the ground running, is an alignment meeting with your oversight folks and get that CEDS committee established. And then we go into the detailed analysis process, where there'll be lots of statistical analysis, lots of interviews, lots of regional focus groups, lots of ways where we collect information, concentrating in part on what kinds of businesses and industries should you be investing in, supporting, trying to make happen in the future. And then we create the draft of it. One of the things that is required by EDA is that we solicit suggestions for projects. And you'll get a whole long list of projects, usually too many to be considered all equal. So then we need to prioritize those and come up with what EDA calls vital projects. And we'll be going through that solicitation and evaluation process. And eventually we have a draft document. There will be a review process. And then we create the final document. And ongoing, cutting across all of these phases, we're going to have as robust a public participation process as we can. That is one of the areas where John and Abby and their Zing process will be applied. I know some of you had the opportunity to see Zing in action today, others did not. I hope you'll swap notes because it's a really effective tool. And then obviously your committees need to be meeting periodically. Deliverables, you see a whole lengthy list of what you are going to get out of this. The statistical profile is going to be put together as much as possible so that it complies with the data standards published by the International Economic Development Council. This is a set of spreadsheets that a bunch of site location consultants agreed on a number of years ago were the data that they need to have almost 100% of the time. So we segmented the nice to have from the need to have, and this will concentrate on the need to have data, and hopefully when that's available it will be useful in your marketing efforts. Overall competitive assessment of Vermont and how it stacks up against competitors, and those competitors may not necessarily be in New England or the Northeast or even the United States. Identify your primary development opportunities, and the guts of it is recommending the initiatives that we think you need to capitalize on. The target cluster stuff I've already mentioned, the priority projects I've already mentioned, the action agenda will cover all of these things. A vision statement, that will relate to the group that's been talking about branding. So I'd be interested to see where that group ends up by the end of the day. Specific goals and objectives, specific strategies and initiatives. For each initiative, we will identify who ought to be in charge and who ought to be in support. What do we need for resources to make it happen? What's the schedule or timeline, the performance measures, and again, how these things relate to other plans. We like to present the initiatives in a format that looks like this, and I realize that's difficult to read, particularly in the back, but this puts in a relatively succinct form all of the things that EDA requires, and more importantly, all of the things that you would need to be thinking about as you move from planning mode to implementation mode. So what are the goals? Why is this important? What are the major action steps and schedule? Who's supposed to be doing it? What do we need for resources, performance measures, time frame, and wherever we can find existing reports, websites, any other information that we think you ought to know about goes into our format for presenting the initiatives. So with that as an overview of what the CEDS process for the state of Vermont is all about, what might you have, so that I don't kill myself tripping over the wire. What do you have for questions, comments, concerns? Can you go get another sandwich? Probably. Yes? We're probably talking, typically they run somewhere 10 months to a year. That's a typical time frame, because EDA is process intensive, and the more people that the key people from all over the state you're trying to have involved, the longer it takes.
So the process you described is very consensuous. We get in a room, we talk, there's solutions proposed, but does the result or your model require some sort of conflict? I mean, are there hard decisions that need to be made, and how does your model account for those once we get outside the consensus building?
Yeah, and of course, consensus is not the same as unanimity. Consensus means you've got a noticeable majority that agrees with something. Conflict is always a potential area, and it also may be that we don't have to have one size fits all for the entire state of Vermont. There may be regionally specific things that make sense some places but don't make sense other places, and that's okay too. the team will be looking for ways to turn conflict into agreement, and it may not be universal agreement. It could be agreeing to disagree, but at least moving forward, because moving forward is, in my estimation, more important than getting everybody in full agreement. What else? I scared you all, huh? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and we typically think of education as being part of workforce. So when you went back to that screen that listed those things, it did specifically talk about workforce. And having the interesting thing is, as I work around the country, I've mentioned this earlier today, and I talk to hundreds of business executives, and I ask them the question, is your higher education system turning out the skills you're going to need 5 years from now? And they almost always do exactly what you did. No. So then my follow-up question is, well, what skills are you going to need 5 years from now? Oh. The typical mindset is 15 to 18 months from now. We can project that far as to what we're going to need, but start to get out 5 years, the crystal ball gets real murky. So it's not so much a matter of the higher educational system better get its act together and start preparing the skills that we're going to need. It's creating a mechanism where the business community and the educational community are constantly in dialogue, identifying the new skills that are going to be necessary as we move into the future. It's sort of like a 5-year capital improvement program for education. It's that revolving, here's what we need next year, and 2, 3, 4, 5, let's cross this year off because we did it, and add another year 5. We need to have that same kind of approach to educational planning and programming. More? Yes? Yes, I mean, that's an interesting question when you talk to EDA in comprising a CEDS committee. Is a private not-for-profit organization the same as a private business? And I've gotten different answers from different people. Whatever they are, they're an essential part of the planning process because they will be an essential part of the implementation process later on. Yes, sir. You're supposed to be using the microphone because they're trying to tape these things.
The ladies didn't have to.
I may be a Marine, but I'm not mean.
Oh, I was Navy, so thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Jerry Hansen, and one of the questions that came up that we identified in our focus group was the redundancy of a lot of services and so forth, and people are kind of entrenched in what they believe are viable entities and services and so forth. And when you break those down, since there's limited funding, how would you go about identifying or getting people to make those changes? It's almost like you got the fox watching the hen house. Change is going to be very difficult.
Yes, it is. Everyone is invested in their own way of doing things, in their own organizations. I'll tell you 2 related stories. One was a little community of 18,000 people. The entire county was 28,000 down in Kentucky that had 4 separate economic development groups. Okay? And we proposed that they somehow rationalize the system. They create a single entity where each one of the 4 existing organizations was a division of that single entity. Because you had businesses that were complaining about having to serve on multiple boards, having to fund multiple organizations, And merely by suggesting that they take that simple step of semi-merging the organizations, I was accused of proposing to put out of business the lengthiest lived and most successful economic development group in the county. And said that at all, but it underscored the fact that people are protective of their own turf. The other example is I was working on a strategy for a workforce development board in a 3-county region of New York State, and in one of those 3 counties we found 43 organizations that thought they were part of the workforce development system. Okay? When you start trying to rationalize that type of delivery system, everybody gets protective of their own turf. So figuring out ways, and I can't give you an answer right now, but I'm aware of the problem, figuring out ways to more effectively rationalize your economic development service delivery system so that we get a better return on investment for the money you're investing in it is going to be absolutely critical to the success of this CEDS. What else? Yep, another one, follow up. Get back to the microphone.
Just to follow up on what you just said, the problem is that some of the things that are really challenging for businesses to either expand their operations or to attract new businesses is the difficulty in answering all the questions and meeting all the parameters that are set up by them because of that redundancy. It doesn't seem to be fair and equitable. So is there, again, a way to have a base protocol so people know exactly what they need to do and where they can get those resources? Because
yeah,
if they have to answer to 5 different agencies, yep, they just spend so much money and so much time and leave in frustration.
Yeah, and I'm thinking perhaps a model could be what Empire State Development in New York has done, recognizing that businesses frequently were proposing to do things that not one entity, not one funding source could solve. So they now have a unified application that pertains to, I don't know, 15 or 20 different funding sources. The business or the community, the county submits the application, and then it's up to the state organizations to meet together to figure out the most effective way to take care of that need. And I can see some variations on that theme as potentially being the model for what you can do here. Good. Yep.
I have a question for you. If the outcome measure is job creation, we have to be rather patient because it might take a while for the seeds that we sow today to result in significant job creation. And part of the problem is our legislators might become impatient with the plan and then decide to stop funding it when we need to have a 5 or even 10-year outlook.
Yes. That's a good statement. I didn't take it as a question.
Well, no, it is a question. And are there other metrics that one can bring to this that might give us a better idea of the short term?
Oh, sure. I mean, job creation was not the only metric that was up there that EDA is looking for. There are a wide variety of other kinds of projects, for instance, infrastructure improvements that will get evaluated in terms of how much public sector money is necessary and how you're going to use that to leverage private sector. Interesting, I just saw an article this morning about how there are venture capitalists who are looking at how can they get involved in investing in infrastructure improvements. So there's new approaches to those kinds of problems that don't involve job creation at all. So they're going to be, yes, jobs, certainly important, although, you heard this morning, unemployment rate, 4%, give or take, half the national average. Many places other than North Dakota, which loves fracking, and I suspect you don't, they're one of the other places that has a low unemployment rate. Well, I suspect, and I've seen this in writing, that while you may have a low unemployment rate, you may have a high underemployment rate, with lots of your college graduates with really good skills, and I met one of them when I was working on the Chittenden County project. There's a kid who came up to UVM from New Jersey, fell in love with this area, and is a waiter at one of the restaurants in downtown Burlington because he refuses to leave the area. And you got a bunch of folks in Vermont that are here for the exact same motivation, and we need to again figure out better employment opportunities for them so that rather than make whatever they're making on minimum wages and tips as servers in restaurants, they can take full advantage of the skills that they've got. Any others? Yep, okay, I think we have time for one more. Yeah, sometimes managing to stay afloat is a positive circumstance. I don't know the answer to that question yet as to how we're going to measure that. Yeah, for starters, somebody's going to need to manufacture Baxter and Patty, so maybe we put together manufacturing plants in robotics, because there's all kinds of robotics and nano-robotics and inflatable robots and all kinds of stuff related to robots that are occurring now. You can be the state-of-the-art economy that moves into the future. Look forward to seeing you all as we carry out this process. It's nice to be here to see so many friends and familiar faces from NEDA conferences and other reasons where I've interacted with Vermont folks. So please stay involved. Please contribute. We can guide the ship, but you got to tell us where you want to go. Thank you.
So those of you in the audience who know me well are wondering, how the hell did Lawrence get us involved in something that is so process-oriented? I promise that the reason that we got Mark involved is not because I've completely come unhinged from my own moorings as you know them, but we recognize it is necessary, though not sufficient, to have this kind of planning done and have somebody like Mark and his organization helping us do it rather than relying on somebody like me to pay attention for that long through this next 12 months to this many details. And it is a lot, because I'll be clear, when the governor asked me to do this job, he was really straightforward about the fact that he sees the work of the agency as being expressed through all of the rest of state government, and that our responsibility is to help ensure that everything our colleagues are doing, part of our responsibility is to make sure that everything our colleagues are doing is done within the context of what's going to help improve Vermont's competitive position and what's going to improve the quality of life for Vermonters, because that's what it really comes down to. It isn't a question of whether or not we've got full employment, which arguably might. It's whether or not we've got maximum employment at everybody's highest and best use. I think we can reasonably agree there's very few people whose highest and best use is flipping burgers. We've got a lot more of them flipping burgers than we need to. If we can offload some of that to lower skilled robots, terrific. If we've got new opportunities for people to pursue that are better suited to their human potential, and so that's overall what we want to accomplish. It's that ability to improve wages faster than the cost of living increase. It isn't just let's see wages grow, it's relative to what. So productivity enhancement is absolutely critical, and that's one of the things we came in. And there's this huge bemoaning of the loss of manufacturing jobs in Vermont over a period of time that, well, yes, we lost manufacturing jobs, output went up 2.5-fold. If our manufacturing sector had not increased its productivity over that time period by that much, we wouldn't have any manufacturing sector at all. So there's a lot of different components to this, and speaker question, it needs the nonprofits, it needs the businesses, it needs schools, it needs members from all walks of life. So we're going to continue this, look for your participation. Right now, we're going to go on to another panel, and we've got another good group of people, and then we'll go back out into the breakout sessions to work on specific achievable outcomes, and then we'll come back for reading